So now that we're actually getting into the construction of the grid, like I mentioned, the grid has a grid. That's for when you actually have three-dimensional geometry and you can't really tell what orientation it has. But for us, we can basically ignore that mini grid in the bottom right or the bottom left corner, which is at the origin. The one that we're concerned with here is this one. And so let's take a look at what it's actually asking for, and then I'll explain to you why it looks the way it does. So the first input, P, is for the base plane of the grid, right? So that's what you see over here, right? The same one that we dropped in with the sphere. That is the base plane. It usually, or not usually, it always comes in with a native value. And so for this one, it's world XY, which is the origin XY. The size of the grid cells. So notice how my Rhino is set to feet. I think you all should be set to feet too. I'm not sure how you opened yours. But basically, if you're set to feet, your grid, as long as you have grids on, will be set to your singular units in that particular spacing. So when this says one locally defined value of 1.0, right, that's saying that every grid cell size is going to be 1 foot. And it's important to note that Grasshopper is unitless. There is no such thing as a unit in Grasshopper. So what that means is if I build a model to a foot and I make it 10 feet long, and I do it in Grasshopper the same way, as long as Rhino is set to feet, it'll be the same size. But if Rhino is set to inches, it'll only be 10 inches long. Does that make sense? It borrows the properties of the unit scale from Rhino. Okay, so the next inputs then, so you've got size of the grid cells, which you know from your Solo Cup exploration yesterday that it's a variable, right? And it can be input either as a static number or a variable number on a slider. And then you've got this EX, which is the number of grid cells in the X direction, and then you've got EY, number of grid cells in the Y direction, and they both have a static predetermined value of 5, which is why up here you see in this little mini grid that's growing out of your origin grid, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cells in either direction. Does that make sense? All right, so now let's play with it. I'm going to go to perspective here so you can see it. Actually, I'll go to top view. So to drop in a number slider, right? So we're not worried about the base plane. I'm not going to change the base plane on you right now. We'll worry about that when the time comes. So really, the only three things that we're going to be worried about here is the size of the grid cells and the number of the grid cells. So I just want to drop sliders on each one. And you know, I don't know if he introduced the shortcut to create a slider, but if you want to create a slider really fast, all you have to do is double click and it brings up your search keyword. So you can search for commands in here too. So if you know a description of what a command does, but you don't know where to find it in all the menus, you can just start typing something in and maybe it'll come up, similar to Rhino. Okay, so in the search thing, rather than actually searching for number slider, the cool thing is you can just say 0 to whatever number you want to start on, say 5 to 10. And then hit enter. So this gives you a slider that has a minimum value of 0, where you started at 5, and a maximum value of 10. So I'm going to go and plug that into S, and you see that now my grid actually increased in size, so that every single one of these cells now is, as long as your grid is on and it is the proper scale, will be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 feet long. And then similarly, you can copy. So I don't know if you know that I typically do Control-C to copy and Control-V to paste. I tend to neglect explaining that to a lot of people who aren't used to doing that all the time. So Control-C and then click off and Control-V and it goes right there. And you can just Control-V again and drop them both in. And then just start plugging and playing. Right? So you plug one into the X, one into the Y. And then at this point, you have full variability to go from either 0, which is going to give you an error, or 10 in either direction. Okay, so what questions do you have?
I guess I have a question.
Yeah.
If you were to create like new spheres and you wanted them to have the properties of that grid, would they be able to have the properties of that grid if you were to attach that node to whatever you're making?
Would spheres be able to have the properties of the grid? Define properties.
I guess would they all be placed on that grid at the same origin, or do they get their own grid?
You could. And you can do it in many different ways. So when we move into the next couple of segments, you'll learn how. Yeah. So any other questions on that one? Cool. So I'm going to stop this video here because it's kind of a full, complete thought, and then I'll move on to something else where we start breaking it down and stuff.